Merle found it a little after 5 in the morning, lying in the wet grass at the edge of his lower hayfield, and his first thought was that one of his neighbor's bulls had gotten loose and gone down with a stroke. His second thought, once he got within 30 feet with his flashlight, was that he was looking at a dogman, and that it was dying in front of him. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. We agreed to change his name for this one, and once you understand what he stood to lose in a county where everybody knows everybody's business, you'll understand why. We'll call him Merle. Todd County, Kentucky is not a place where a farmer's word travels quietly. There are maybe 900 people in Elkton, the county seat, and if Merle's name gets attached to a story about a dying dogman in his bottom field, he will be the punchline at the Sinclair station and the co-op feed store for the rest of his natural life, and nobody in that county will loan him equipment or split a hay crew with him ever again. That is not a small thing when your whole operation runs on the goodwill of your neighbors. So we are calling him Merle, and everything else about the land, the road, the river, and the weather that night is exactly as it happened, because that part he wants people to be able to check for themselves. Merle farms a little over 400 acres on the Pennyroyal Plateau in the western part of Todd County, Kentucky, on ground that has been in his family since his grandfather bought it in the years right after the Second World War. The farm sits along a stretch of bottomland cut by the sinking fork of the Red River, a slow, tea-colored creek that drains a wide swath of karst country between Elkton and the Christian County line. Karst is the word geologists use for this kind of ground. Limestone bedrock, dissolved over millions of years by slightly acidic rainwater, riddled underneath with caves, sinkholes, and underground drainage that swallows creeks whole in dry years and floods pastures without warning in wet ones. The Pennyroyal Plateau gets its name from the pennyroyal mint that used to grow wild across the region, and it stretches across a dozen counties in south-central Kentucky, the same limestone belt that produces Mammoth Cave a little further east. Merle's lower field, the one where he found what he found, sits in a natural swale about a quarter mile from the creek, ground that floods first and drains last on the whole farm. Ground, his father always said, was more trouble than it was worth to plant, but too good for grazing to give up. Merle is 56. He has raised cattle and grown dark-fired tobacco on this ground his entire adult life. The same crop his father and grandfather grew, the leaf that gets hung and smoked over smoldering hardwood fires in curing barns instead of air-cured like the burley crop further east, a tradition specific to this stretch of western Kentucky and adjoining Tennessee that goes back to before the Civil War. He runs about 60 head of Angus cross cattle on rotational pasture, keeps a 200-acre tobacco base that has shrunk over the years as the contracts got harder to come by, and does custom hay work for 3 or 4 neighboring operations to make the equipment payments pencil out. He is up before 4 most mornings, in bed most nights by 9, and he has walked every acre of that farm enough times that he can tell you which fence post is loose and which spring seep never quite dries up in August without looking twice. That kind of familiarity matters to this story, because a man who does not know his own ground could mistake all kinds of things for all kinds of other things. Merle does not have that problem. He knows exactly what belongs on his farm and what does not. His wife, we'll call her Faye, teaches 3rd grade at the elementary school in Elkton. They have 2 grown kids, a daughter finishing a nursing program at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, and a son who works construction out of Hopkinsville, both of them still close enough to come home most weekends, and a granddaughter, 7 years old, who was staying with Merle and Faye that particular week while her parents dealt with a move. Merle's farmhouse itself dates to the 1950s, a plain frame house his grandfather built after buying the land, added on to twice over the decades as the family grew and then shrank back down again once the kids left for college and careers of their own. It sits on a low rise about a quarter mile off the county road, with the barn and equipment shed clustered behind it and the curing barns for the tobacco crop set further back, closer to the fields where the leaf actually grows. From the front porch, on a clear day, you can see clean across the rolling pasture toward the tree line along the sinking fork, close to a mile of open ground with nothing to interrupt the view but a scattering of old fence posts and the occasional grazing group of cattle. It is the kind of view Merle has looked at every morning of his life. The kind that stops registering as scenery after enough decades and simply becomes the fixed backdrop against which everything else in a man's life happens. Merle's daily routine, before any of this happened, ran on a rhythm that had not changed meaningfully in 30 years. Up before 4, coffee at the kitchen table while he checked the overnight weather and cattle prices on his phone, out to feed and check stock by first light, into the fields, or the equipment shed depending on the season, home for supper with Faye most evenings by 6, unless haying season or tobacco cutting pushed things later. He is a deacon at the small Baptist church he and Faye have attended their whole married life, coaches Little League in the spring when his schedule allows it, and sits on the board of the local Farm Bureau chapter, the kind of quiet, steady civic presence that small agricultural counties depend on and rarely think to thank by name. None of that changed after the storm. What changed sat underneath it, in ways that took Merle himself a long time to fully recognize. Faye grew up in Elkton itself, the daughter of a hardware store owner, and met Merle at a county fair when they were both teenagers, the kind of small-town courtship that still produces most marriages in a place where the graduating class at Todd County Central High School rarely tops 100 students. She has taught 3rd grade at the elementary school for 26 years, long enough to have taught the children of some of her own former students, and she brings to this story the same careful, unflappable steadiness that has made her, by every account, from parents and colleagues, one of the most trusted teachers in the building. That steadiness is part of why Merle trusted his own instincts enough to get her and their granddaughter into the truck at 4 in the morning without a full explanation. In over 30 years of marriage, he has learned that Faye does not panic, and that if he told her to move quickly, she would move quickly and ask the necessary questions once they were safely somewhere else.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time, so if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Merle's granddaughter had been staying with them for 11 days by that point, her parents in the middle of a move to a new house across the state line in Tennessee, close enough that the family saw each other most weekends, but far enough that the girl's extended stay with her grandparents had become something of a settled routine for that particular stretch of the fall. That is who was on the property the night this happened: Merle, Faye, and a 7-year-old girl asleep in the back bedroom of a farmhouse, a half-mile from the field, where Merle would soon find an animal that should not have been there. The night before, a Tuesday in late September, had been unremarkable by every measure that matters to a farmer. Merle had spent the afternoon moving cattle off a paddock along the creek bottom because the grass was getting grazed down and he wanted to rest it before frost. He remembers the specifics because he keeps a grazing log, a habit his father drilled into him, tracking which paddock gets grazed on which date so he can plan his rotation a year out. He had checked the weather that evening, the way he checks it every evening, pulling up the National Weather Service forecast out of the Nashville office, which covers this part of southern Kentucky, and the forecast called for a chance of scattered evening storm clearing out overnight. Nothing severe. A fairly ordinary late September system moving through ahead of a cold front. He went to bed a little after 9 with nothing on his mind but the tobacco he needed to start cutting that week if the weather held. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, his dog woke him. Merle keeps 2 Australian shepherds for working cattle, and the older one, a dog he has had for 9 years, and who does not spook at thunder, deer, coyotes, or the occasional bear that wanders down out of the land between the lakes area to the west, was standing at the bedroom window with her hackles up, making a low sound in her chest that Merle had never heard out of her before. Not a bark, a kind of continuous, tight-throated growl that did not stop when he told her to hush. He got up to look, mostly to quiet the dog before she woke the house, and that is when he saw the lightning. Not the ordinary scattered kind the forecast had promised. A wall of continuous strobing light on the southwestern horizon, the kind that comes from a squall line rather than isolated cells, close enough together that the flashes overlapped into something closer to a strobe than individual bolts. He had lived under Kentucky skies his whole life, and he knew what that particular signature meant even before he thought to check a radar app on his phone. That is what a line does right before it produces damaging wind, and sometimes worse. He was reaching for his phone when the dog's growl changed into something closer to a whine, and she backed away from the window instead of toward it, which was completely out of character for an animal that had never once retreated from anything on that farm in 9 years. Merle almost did not go outside. He wants that part on the record, because he has turned this over in his head hundreds of times since, and he has to be honest that the version of events where he stays in the house and goes back to bed was available to him, and he almost took it. What made him go outside was a sound he heard through the window glass, faint, coming from the direction of the lower field, that he could not place and that his gut told him was an animal in serious distress. Farmers develop an ear for that. A cow having trouble calving, a horse cast in a stall, a dog hit by a truck on the county road, all of them produce a particular register of sound that cuts through a man's sleep in a way ordinary night noise does not. Merle grabbed a flashlight, pulled on his boots, and told Faye he was going to check the lower field, that it sounded like one of the cows might be down. He did not take a gun. That detail matters to him now, retroactively, though at 4 a.m. with what he thought was a sick cow on his hands, it did not occur to him as a decision at all. The walk down to the lower field from the house is about a half-mile on a gravel farm lane that Merle's father cut through the pasture decades ago, running along a fence line before dropping down into the swale near the creek. He walked it in the dark the way he has walked it 10,000 times, his flashlight beam bouncing on the gravel, the wind starting to pick up out of the southwest ahead of that lightning, and the sound getting louder and stranger the closer he got. Not a cow. He knew that within the first 100 yards, though it took him longer to admit to himself what he was actually hearing. A kind of rasping, effortful breathing, deep and wet-sounding, mixed with something almost like a moan, low in pitch, that rose and fell with the breathing, rather than existing as a separate sound. He came over the last rise above the swale and swung his flashlight down into the field, and what the beam found stopped him cold in the gravel. It was down on its side in the wet grass about 40 yards off the lane, and even collapsed and clearly in distress. The scale of it was wrong for anything Merle had ever encountered on that farm or anywhere else. He estimated later, once he had time to think about reference points, that stretched out the way it was lying. It measured close to 7.5 feet from the top of its head to where its legs ended, though the legs were bent under it in a way that made a precise measurement impossible in the moment. It was covered in coarse, dark fur, close to black in the flashlight beam, matted with mud, and what Merle was fairly sure was blood along the lower half of its body. The chest was heaving with each breath, in a way that reminded Merle uncomfortably of a cow with a ruptured lung. That particular labored effort, where you can see the animal working for every breath and losing ground anyway. The head was the part that told him what he was looking at, because there was no ambiguity in it once his flashlight settled on it. Elongated, with a distinct muzzle projecting forward from the skull, and ears set high, though one of them appeared to be torn or folded from whatever injury had put it on the ground. Merle has spent his whole life around working dogs and hunting dogs, and he told us the proportions were canine in the same way a German shepherd's skull is canine, but scaled up onto a body with shoulders and a chest built more like a man's than a dog's, if a man's shoulders were twice as wide as they should be. It saw him. That is the part Merle comes back to every time he tells this. He had assumed, in the half-second before the animal's head turned toward his flashlight beam, that whatever this was had to be nearly dead, too far gone to register a human standing 40 yards away. Its eyes opened and found the light and found him, and there was nothing dulled or distant in that look. Merle used the word aware. He said it was the same look he has gotten from a bull he was about to load onto a trailer. An animal sizing him up and making a decision about him in real time. For a few long seconds, neither of them moved. Merle standing on the lane with his flashlight, the animal down in the grass with its chest heaving, the wind picking up around both of them, and the lightning building on the horizon behind Merle's back. Then it did the last thing Merle expected from a dying animal in any species he had ever dealt with. It moved, not toward him. It dragged itself, using what strength remained in its front limbs, turning its body so that its head and one arm were oriented back toward Merle's house, up the lane, in the direction he had just walked from. And it raised that arm, trembling with the effort, and made a motion that Merle has described to us, carefully, several times, because he knows exactly how it sounds. And he does not care. A pushing motion, away from itself, toward the house, repeated twice, the fingers spreading and closing each time. Along with the motion came a sound distinct from the labored breathing, a short, urgent series of low tones, 3 of them, rising slightly in pitch each time, that Merle said reminded him more than anything of the way you would try to shout through a mouth full of water. Not words. He is clear about that. Not English, not any language, nothing that resembled speech in the way speech works. But he has no doubt, and he has never had a moment's doubt since, that it was trying to communicate something urgent, and that the something was about the house. He looked over his shoulder, back toward the farm, back toward where his wife and granddaughter were asleep, and back at the lightning, which had gotten measurably closer and brighter in the 2 or 3 minutes he had been standing there, and something in his gut, the same instinct that had gotten him out of bed in the first place, told him the 2 things were connected, that whatever was dying in his field was trying to tell him to get his family away from that house before whatever was building on the horizon arrived. He does not remember deciding to run. He remembers running, back up the lane, flashlight beam jerking wildly with each stride, phone already coming out of his pocket, dialing Faye's cell before he was even halfway back to the house because he did not trust himself to explain what he had just seen out loud and wanted her moving before he had to. She was awake when he burst through the door, standing in the hallway in her robe, asking what was wrong with the cattle. And Merle told her to forget the cattle, to get their granddaughter up and get her in the truck, that there was a bad storm coming and he wanted them off this property and down at her sister's place in Elkton, a modern brick house 8 miles east on Highway 80 with a finished basement. Immediately, he did not mention what he had seen in the field. Not then. There was no time. And even if there had been time, he did not have words for it yet that would not have sounded like the ravings of a man who had lost his mind at 4 in the morning. Faye asked him once, sharply, whether this was really about the weather. Merle told her it was, and that he would explain everything once they were safe. She has told us since that something in his face stopped her from arguing further. In over 30 years of marriage, she said, she had seen her husband calm through a barn fire and calm through a hospital stay with his own father, and she had never once seen him look the way he looked, standing in that hallway at 4:15 in the morning. She got their granddaughter up, wrapped in a blanket, and the 3 of them were in Merle's truck and headed east on the county road, within 11 minutes of him coming through the door. The 8 miles between Merle's farm and his sister-in-law's brick house on the east side of Elkton run mostly along Highway 80 before cutting south on a county road for the last 1.5 miles, and Merle drove that stretch faster than he has ever driven it before or since, watching the lightning build in his rearview mirror the whole way. Faye sat in the passenger seat with their granddaughter wrapped in a blanket across her lap, the girl half awake and asking sleepy questions about why they were going to Aunt Peggy's house in the middle of the night. And Faye kept her voice steady and answered every question, the way a woman who has spent 30 years teaching 3rd graders how to stay calm during tornado drills knows how to answer a frightened child. Even while her own hands, Merle noticed once they had a moment to talk about it later, were gripping the blanket tight enough to leave marks in the fabric. They made it to Peggy's house and got down into the finished basement with maybe 10 minutes to spare before the worst of it arrived. Peggy, Faye's older sister, had lived through enough Kentucky spring storm seasons to keep a battery-powered weather radio charged and ready in that basement year-round. And it was that radio, not Merle's phone, that gave them the first official confirmation of what was moving through the county. The Nashville Forecast Office issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Todd County at 4:41 that morning, describing wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour. And quarter-sized hail associated with a fast-moving line of storms, and updated it within the hour to reflect the higher gusts the survey teams would later confirm on the ground. Merle remembers sitting on a folding chair in his sister-in-law's basement, his granddaughter finally asleep again against Faye's shoulder, listening to that warning come across the radio, a full 15 minutes after he had already gotten his family behind concrete block walls, a half-mile underground from where a dying animal had used its last strength to point him toward. Exactly this kind of shelter. The power in Peggy's neighborhood flickered twice and held. 2 blocks over, a transformer blew with enough force that Merle heard it even from the basement, a heavy concussive crack, followed by a greenish flash visible through the small egress window near the ceiling. The whole event, from the moment the wind arrived to the moment the worst of it passed, lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though Merle says it felt considerably longer sitting in that basement, not knowing yet what had happened to the house and the animals he had left behind. What came through Todd County that morning, according to the National Weather Service survey conducted out of the Nashville Forecast Office in the days that followed, was a bow echo, a section of squall line that had organized into a curved, fast-moving segment producing a swath of straight-line wind damage, consistent with what meteorologists classify as a derecho-scale event, when it covers enough distance, though this particular system did not travel far enough to formally qualify for that designation. The survey documented wind gusts estimated between 70 and 85 miles per hour along a corridor that cut directly across the western half of Todd County, snapping mature hardwoods, peeling metal, roofing off outbuildings, and downing power lines across a 15-mile swath before the line continued northeast into Christian County and beyond. Kentucky Utilities and Pennyroyal Electric both reported thousands of customers without power by daybreak. The survey report, which is public record and available through the National Weather Service's Nashville office, specifically noted wind damage concentrated along a corridor that passed within a half-mile of Merle's farm. Merle's house lost most of its roof. The wind took the western half of it clean off, along with the old oak that had shaded the front porch since before Merle was born, which came down across the exact spot in the driveway where his truck would have been parked if they had not left. The chimney on that side collapsed into what had been the guest bedroom, the room where his granddaughter would have been sleeping. The barn where he keeps his hay equipment lost its entire roof structure. A grain bin was folded over onto itself like a beer can. By any reasonable estimate, had Faye and their granddaughter still been in that house when the worst of that wind came through, the outcome would have been very different from a family standing in a finished basement 8 miles away watching the power flicker and go out. The timing is what makes this impossible to file away as instinct or coincidence, and it is the detail Merle keeps returning to when he talks about it. He got that warning, whatever form it came in, roughly 25 to 30 minutes before the worst of the wind arrived at his farm, at a point when the National Weather Service had not yet issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Todd County. The warning came out of the Nashville office at 4:41 that morning. Merle was already on the road with his family by 4:26. Something in that field knew what was coming before the professional meteorologists tracking that storm on radar had enough data to issue an alert, and it used whatever was left of its dying strength to make sure Merle understood the message. That kind of anticipatory behavior is not unheard of in the animal world, and it is worth being precise about what actual science supports here, rather than reaching for anything supernatural. Animals across many species demonstrate documented sensitivity to the sharp barometric pressure drops that precede severe weather, and there is a body of research, going back decades, on animals responding to infrasound, extremely low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing that travel enormous distances through the atmosphere and the ground and are known to be generated by severe storm systems, tornadoes in particular, well before the visible weather arrives. Elephants are documented responding to infrasound from distant thunderstorms. Cattle are well known among farmers for behavioral changes hours ahead of severe weather, which is part of why Merle trusts his own instincts about reading storms as much as he trusts a forecast. If something living in that field bottom had a nervous system tuned to detect the specific infrasound signature and pressure collapse of an approaching squall line, sensitivity considerably more acute than what a domestic animal displays would not be biologically implausible. It would be, in fact, exactly the kind of adaptation you would expect from an apex predator that spends its life outdoors in a region that gets hammered by severe convective weather on a regular basis, an animal that has survived here for a very long time precisely because it reads the sky better than the things it shares that sky with. What is much harder to explain through ordinary animal behavior is the deliberate, directional nature of what Merle witnessed. A spooked animal runs from a storm. It does not turn toward a human being it has never met. On a dying body it can barely move, and use its last reserves of strength to gesture at a specific structure and make a repeated vocalization that any reasonable person would interpret. In context, as an urgent warning aimed at protecting that human's family rather than itself. Merle went back to the field once the worst of the storm had passed, and the wind had dropped enough to make the roads passable, a little before 7 that morning. Alone, without telling Faye where he was going, he found the spot in the grass where it had been lying. He found blood, a substantial amount of it, soaked into the ground and matted into the grass over an area roughly 6 feet across. He found drag marks leading away from that spot, toward the tree line along the creek, deep gouges torn into the wet ground, consistent with something heavy, pulling itself along using its arms because its legs were no longer functioning. He followed the drag marks about 80 yards to the edge of the timber, where they simply stopped at the base of a large sycamore near the creek bank, and there was no body. There was, however, a great deal of blood pooled at that spot, more than Merle believed any animal could lose and survive much longer, and there were other tracks in the softer ground near the creek, multiple sets, he told us. At least 2 other individuals, based on size variation between the prints, had come to that spot from the direction of the timber, and the drag marks leading away from the blood pool suggested something had been moved, not simply that the original animal had continued moving on its own. Whatever Merle found in his field that morning did not walk away under its own power. Something came for it. The days that followed were harder on Merle than the storm itself, and that is saying something, because the storm cost him close to $40,000 in roof, barn, and grain bin damage that his insurance adjuster spent 3 separate visits arguing about. He had to explain to the adjuster, to 2 contractors, and eventually to his own son, why he had moved his family out of the house at 4 in the morning based on nothing more than a bad feeling about the sky, and he found himself giving a version of the story that left out the field entirely, because the version with the field in it was not one he was ready to say out loud to anyone who had not been there. Faye was the first person he told everything to, 3 nights after the storm, sitting at the kitchen table under a tarp-covered section of roof with a contractor's estimate spread out between them. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which Merle said was its own kind of miracle given what he was describing. And when he finished, she asked him a single question. She asked whether he thought it had done that because it wanted something from him, or because it simply did not want to see a family die in a house a half-mile from where it had chosen to lie down and die itself. Merle did not have an answer then. He is not sure he has one now, but the question stuck with both of them, because it reframed the entire encounter away from the language of monster movies and towards something closer to what you would say about a neighbor who bangs on your door in the middle of the night to tell you your barn is on fire, expecting nothing in return, except that you get out. The morning after he found the drag marks and the second set of tracks, Merle did something he had never done in 56 years of farming that ground. He called the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. He did not tell the dispatcher, or the conservation officer who eventually called him back, anything about a dogman. He is not foolish, and he understood before he ever picked up the phone exactly how far he could push that conversation before it stopped being useful to him and started being a liability. What he told the officer was that he had found evidence of a large, unidentified animal, likely deceased or severely injured, on his property following the storm, along with blood sign and tracks, suggesting the carcass had been moved by other animals, and he wanted to know if the department had any interest in investigating given the unusual size and track pattern. The officer who called him back, a conservation officer covering the district that includes Todd, Christian, and several surrounding counties, drove out 2 days later. Merle walked him down to the field, showed him the blood sign, which was still visible though degraded by 2 days of weather, and showed him photographs he had taken on his phone of a partial track he had found in the softer ground near the sycamore before that ground dried and lost definition. The officer looked at the photographs for a long time. He measured the track's approximate depth relative to a stick Merle had laid across it for scale in the photo. And then he told Merle words that Merle has repeated back to us almost verbatim because they stuck with him ever since. The officer said the size and depth were consistent with something considerably larger than any documented Kentucky predator, that the department's identification protocols covered black bear, coyote, bobcat, and increasingly documented but still rare gray wolf dispersers from northern populations, and that whatever left that track did not fit cleanly into any of those categories using the measurements in front of him. He said the department had no mechanism for classifying or investigating an animal outside its recognized list, and that absent a carcass, a clear photograph, or a specimen, there was nothing further his office could do. He suggested, not unkindly, that heavy rain and storm debris sometimes distorted tracks in ways that made ordinary animals look larger than they were, and that he would log the report as an unconfirmed large canid sighting and move on to his next call. The mechanism behind that outcome is worth spelling out in specific terms, because it is easy to hear a story like this and assume some deliberate decision was made somewhere to look away. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources maintains a wildlife incident reporting system built around a defined drop-down list of species the department is equipped to investigate: coyote, black bear, bobcat, gray wolf, as an emerging category tied to specific dispersal monitoring out of source populations to the north, and a handful of others. There is no field on that form for unidentified large bipedal canid, and there is no supervisory pathway for an officer to escalate a report that does not fit an existing category into some kind of special investigation, because no such pathway has ever been built. If the officer who visited Merle's farm had written up a report describing a track pattern consistent with a 7-foot bipedal animal exhibiting apparent hand-like grip structure, that report would have gone to a district supervisor with no protocol for handling it, who would have had to decide, on his own authority, whether to forward it further up a chain that has no established landing place for it, at real risk to his own professional standing and the officer's credibility with his colleagues. The rational, career-protecting choice, made by a professional with no institutional cover to do anything else, was to log the encounter under the closest available category and move forward. Nobody made a decision to suppress anything. The form itself made the decision, the way it has apparently made the same decision in Michigan, in Oregon, and in every other state where researchers have documented officials running into the exact same wall. Merle understood exactly what had just happened. Not indifference, not disbelief, necessarily. A system that genuinely had no box to check, staffed by a professional who was not going to put his own credibility on the line, chasing something his department's own database did not recognize as a possibility. That is the mechanism that keeps most of this world invisible, and it has nothing to do with cover-ups or men in black. It has to do with forms that only have so many lines on them. What Merle did next, over the following 2 weeks, was something closer to a full private investigation than a farmer's idle curiosity, and it changed the way he understood everything that had happened on his land. He started by pulling every piece of information he could find about strange animal sightings in Todd and the surrounding counties going back decades. He is not a computer-literate man by his own admission, but his daughter, home for a weekend from her nursing program, helped him search through local newspaper archives and old online forums where people in western Kentucky occasionally posted about odd encounters in the woods. What they found was not a single sensational case, but a quiet, scattered pattern going back generations, the kind of thing that never made headlines because none of it was dramatic enough on its own to justify one, but that added up to something once you started connecting the locations on a map. There was a report from 1988, printed as a small item in a regional paper covering rural Kentucky and Tennessee, describing a hunter near the Christian County line who claimed something large and upright had crossed a logging road in front of his truck late at night, moving on 2 legs before dropping to all 4s and disappearing into brush. There was an account, second-hand and unverifiable, but persistent in local memory, according to 2 older farmers Merle spoke with directly, of livestock losses along the Pennyroyal Plateau in the 1970s, attributed at the time to a large stray dog or wolf-dog hybrid that was never caught despite repeated efforts by county agents. And there was, more significantly to Merle, a cluster of unexplained cattle deaths reported to the county extension office across 3 separate farms along the Sinking Fork drainage between 1991 and 94, all involving animals found with what necropsy notes on file, with the extension office described as a single deep puncture wound to the throat and minimal surrounding tissue damage, inconsistent with typical predator kills from coyotes or dogs, which tend to be messier and more prolonged. None of those necropsy findings were ever conclusively attributed to a specific predator. The Extension Office file, which Merle was able to review because a retired agent he has known for years still had personal copies of his old case notes, simply listed the cause as unknown predation and moved on. Taken individually, none of this proves anything. Taken together, it describes a pattern of low-grade, chronic activity along a specific drainage corridor, stretching back at least 3.5 decades. Activity that never rose to the level of a documented, verified encounter, because nobody was connecting the individual incidents to each other, and because every single person who experienced one of them had exactly the same incentive Merle has to keep quiet about it. The geography matters here in a way that goes beyond simple coincidence. The sinking fork of the Red River is part of a larger drainage system, and the Red River itself eventually joins the Cumberland River system, which connects to a broader network of waterways and unbroken forest corridor running through western Kentucky, including the massive Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area straddling the Kentucky and Tennessee border about 40 miles to the west, a peninsula of nearly 200,000 acres between Kentucky Lake and Lake Barkley that has been managed largely as unbroken forest habitat since the 1960s, when the Tennessee Valley Authority created it by displacing the small farming communities that had lived there for generations. Land Between the Lakes today supports a restored bison and elk herd, extensive undeveloped forest, and a level of human disturbance low enough that wildlife biologists have documented recovering populations of species that had been locally extirpated for a century. It is, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of habitat corridor that would allow a large, elusive predator population to maintain a range stretching across multiple counties while rarely coming into sustained contact with people, moving along waterways and forest cover between the Land Between the Lakes core and the smaller drainages, like the sinking fork that finger out from it into farm country. The history of how that recreation area came to exist is itself a story about displacement and quiet loss that adds another layer to this account. The Tennessee Valley Authority, exercising eminent domain authority granted to it under federal law, relocated hundreds of farming families off that peninsula between the Cumberland and Tennessee River valleys in the early 1960s, condemning land that some of those families had worked for generations, in order to create what was at the time framed as a public demonstration area for outdoor recreation and resource management. The elk and bison herds maintained today within the elk and bison prairie enclosure, established in the mid-1990s, represent a deliberate reintroduction of species that had been absent from Kentucky and Tennessee for well over a century, a restoration project that succeeded specifically because the surrounding forest had been allowed to mature largely undisturbed for 3 decades before the herds were brought in. If an undocumented predator population had already been using that same undisturbed forest corridor before the TVA ever arrived, the displacement of human farming families in the 1960s would have done nothing but expand the available range for an animal population that had far less reason to avoid people before the land emptied out around it than it has had every year since. The historical and cultural layer of this story goes back much further than the 20th century. And it is worth being precise here, because this region of Kentucky occupies a strange position in the broader history of Native American settlement that most people, even most Kentuckians, do not fully understand. Unlike much of the eastern United States, Kentucky at the time of European contact had no single, dominant, permanently settled tribal nation controlling the interior of the state. This is well documented in Kentucky historical scholarship. The Shawnee maintained village sites and hunting camps primarily north of the Ohio River, in what is now Ohio and Indiana, while the Cherokee held territory to the south and east, and both nations, along with the Chickasaw further west, used the interior of Kentucky as a shared and heavily contested hunting ground, rather than a place of permanent settlement. Early Kentucky settlers and later historians came to call the region the Dark and Bloody Ground, a phrase that shows up repeatedly in 19th century accounts of the state's early settlement period, referring both to the intense, often violent conflict between competing tribal groups over hunting rights in the region, and to the brutal frontier warfare that followed white settlement in the 1770s and 80s. Daniel Boone himself, whose documented explorations brought him through this exact stretch of the Pennyroyal region in the 1770s, wrote and spoke of central Kentucky as land that multiple tribal nations used but that none permanently occupied, precisely because it functioned as a shared and fiercely defended hunting territory rather than anyone's home ground. That distinction matters enormously for understanding why the oral tradition around this specific region is thinner and harder to trace than it is in areas with a single continuous tribal presence, like the Great Lakes region, where Ojibwe and Potawatomi traditions have been documented in detail by researchers like Linda Godfrey over 3 decades of sustained work. Kentucky's interior does not have that same continuity of a single people's stories passed down in a single place across centuries, because no single people held that specific ground continuously long enough for that kind of tradition to calcify the way it has further north. What exists instead, scattered across Shawnee and Cherokee accounts recorded by 19th century ethnographers and missionaries working among both nations after their removal, are references to territories considered dangerous to enter, hunting grounds, where certain parties of hunters simply did not return, and warnings passed between hunting parties about specific stretches of forest and cave country, where something other than rival tribes made the ground unsafe. These references are fragmentary. They do not name a specific creature the way later popular Dogman folklore does, and it would be dishonest and disrespectful to claim otherwise, or to manufacture a tidier tradition than what the historical record actually supports. What they do establish, reliably and without embellishment, is that the interior of Kentucky was understood by the people who knew this land most intimately, long before any European ever set foot in it, as ground that was shared, contested, and in certain specific places, avoided. Kentucky's karst geology adds another layer that deserves attention on its own terms. The limestone plateau that runs beneath Merle's farm and much of south-central Kentucky is riddled with an enormous network of caves, most of them unmapped, connected in places to the same cave systems that make Mammoth Cave, roughly 60 miles to the east, the longest known cave system on Earth, at over 400 miles of surveyed passage, with cavers and geologists adding newly discovered passage virtually every year. A predator adapted to using cave systems for shelter, den sites, and movement between surface locations would have access, in this specific region, to a subterranean travel network that no other Dogman habitat described in the broader body of reports, whether in the Great Lakes, hardwood forests, or the Pacific Northwest timberland, can match. It would explain a pattern of activity that surfaces briefly in specific drainage corridors like the Sinking Fork, and then disappears without a trace, because the animal is not simply walking off into distant timber the way witnesses describe further north. It may be going underground, into a limestone labyrinth that human researchers have spent over 2 centuries mapping and still have not fully charted. If you have ever farmed or hunted along the Pennyroyal Plateau, anywhere between Elkton and the land between the lakes, you know how quickly that country goes from open pasture to genuinely wild ground once you cross a fence line into the timber along a creek bottom. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything happen out there that you couldn't explain, because, based on what Merle and his neighbors have quietly compared notes on since this happened, that drainage has a longer history of unexplained activity than most people in Todd County would ever admit out loud. Going back over the encounter itself with the benefit of 2 weeks of research changed how Merle understood what he had witnessed that morning. His first pass through the memory, in the hours right after it happened, was pure animal terror and adrenaline, the same reaction anyone would have standing 40 yards from something that large and that clearly capable of violence. His second pass, once he had time to sit with it, focused on the deliberateness of what he saw. He kept returning to the specific mechanics of the gesture, the way the creature had used its one working arm, the repetition of the motion, exactly twice, and the 3-tone vocalization that accompanied it. 2 men Merle eventually confided in, a hunting buddy who spent 4 years in the Army and a large animal veterinarian who has treated Merle's cattle for over a decade, both told him independently that the deliberate repetition struck them as significant. Animals in genuine death throes do not typically produce controlled, repeated signals. They thrash, they vocalize randomly, their motor control degrades. What Merle described was closer to a wounded soldier, directing a rescue team toward a threat with his last useful movements than it was to an animal simply dying. The veterinarian has worked large animal practice out of a clinic serving Todd and Logan counties for close to 15 years, after completing veterinary school at Auburn University and returning to this part of Kentucky specifically because her own family farms in the area, and she wanted to build a practice close to home. She handles calving emergencies, herd health, and the occasional wildlife-related livestock injury across dozens of operations in the region, and Merle has trusted her judgment on his own cattle for over a decade. She, who asked not to be named at all in connection with this story given her professional standing in a small agricultural community where her livelihood depends on ranchers trusting her judgment, did agree to look at Merle's photographs of the blood sign and the partial track under condition of strict anonymity. Her assessment, delivered to Merle directly and relayed to us secondhand, was that the blood volume and pattern were consistent with a significant vascular injury, likely from blunt force trauma, given the absence of any laceration pattern in the surrounding grass, and that whatever left that blood pool had suffered an injury serious enough that survival without intervention would have been unlikely regardless of species. Her working theory, offered cautiously and only as a private guess rather than a formal opinion, was that the animal had likely been struck by a vehicle. Kentucky Highway 80 runs along the northern edge of Merle's property, a two-lane state highway carrying significant nighttime traffic between Elkton and Hopkinsville, and it would not be the first time a large animal crossing that road at night in poor visibility met a vehicle it could not get clear of in time. If that theory holds, the animal Merle found had already been struck and mortally injured on the highway before it made its way, on failing legs, roughly a third of a mile across pasture to the exact spot in Merle's field where he found it, at almost the precise moment the storm system that would have killed his family was closing in. Whether that sequence of events reflects deliberate intent, an animal seeking help from the nearest human dwelling it knew of while it still had strength to reach one, or whether it is a set of coincidences that only feels purposeful in retrospect, is a question Merle has stopped trying to answer definitively. What he has not stopped doing is thinking about the two sets of tracks that came for the body afterward, the presence of at least two other individuals converging on that spot within hours, based on the freshness of the tracks Merle photographed before the ground dried, tells its own story. This was not a solitary animal. Whatever species this is, it operates within some kind of social structure tight enough that others came looking, presumably drawn by the same low-frequency vocalizations that Merle heard, carried much further than his own limited hearing range could register, and that they recovered the body rather than leaving it for scavengers or for Merle to find again. That behavior, recovering and removing an injured or deceased member of the group rather than abandoning it, is documented in a narrow band of highly social mammal species, most notably elephants and some primates, and it implies a level of social bonding and cooperative behavior considerably beyond what wildlife biology attributes to any known North American predator. Linda Godfrey's 3 decades of case collection, focused primarily on the Great Lakes region, but extending into a much wider geographic pattern by the time of her later books, documented recurring behavioral themes that show up again in Merle's account with striking consistency. Deliberate restraint in the presence of humans, even when the creature held every physical advantage. Vocalizations described by independent witnesses across different states and different decades using strikingly similar language, low, structured, and distinct from any known animal call. And perhaps most significantly for this particular case, isolated but persistent reports across her collected files of witnesses who described feeling that an encounter, however brief, carried some kind of communicative intent rather than pure predatory calculation. Godfrey herself was always cautious about overinterpreting these accounts, and that caution is appropriate here too. But caution does not mean dismissal, and a case like Merle's, where the communicative behavior culminated in a verifiable, externally confirmed outcome, namely a family that left a house roughly 30 minutes before it lost its roof to a documented severe weather event, moves this specific account out of the realm of subjective impression and into something considerably harder to wave away. What this encounter cost Merle is harder to quantify than the roof and the barn, both of which his insurance eventually covered, after months of back and forth with an adjuster who kept describing the claimed wind speeds as inconsistent with the damage photographs until the official National Weather Service survey came. back and settled the argument for him. The harder cost is the one that shows up in small ways, in the changes his family has watched happen to a man they have always known as steady to the point of dullness. Merle does not walk the lower field alone after dark anymore. For 56 years, checking cattle at odd hours, walking fence lines by flashlight, none of that ever bothered him. Now, if something needs checking on that end of the farm after sundown, he brings his son along when his son is home, or he waits for daylight, and he has never once explained this change to anyone who did not already know why. His hunting buddy, the one with the army background, noticed that Merle stopped taking his hound out for late-season rabbit hunts along the creek bottom, something they had done together every winter for close to 20 years. When his friend asked why, Merle said his knees were bothering him too much for that kind of walking anymore, which both men understood, without saying so directly, was not the real reason. Faye has told us, in a brief conversation she agreed to on the condition that we not use any identifying detail beyond her relationship to Merle, that the hardest part for her was not what happened that night. It was watching her husband carry something afterward that he could not fully share with her, even though she had believed him completely from the first telling. She said a man who spent 30 years being the same dependable presence at the same kitchen table every morning now has nights where she wakes up and finds him standing at the back window, looking out at a field he has walked his entire life, and she does not ask what he is looking for because she already knows he could not put it into words even if she did. The institutional dimension of this story deserves its own honest accounting, because it is not a conspiracy in any organized sense. It is simpler and, in some ways, more unsettling than that. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources has a wildlife identification and reporting protocol built around a defined list of species known to occur in the state. That list, understandably, does not include a category for an unclassified large bipedal canid. And the conservation officer who came out to Merle's farm was, by every account Merle gives, professional, courteous, and entirely within the bounds of his job description when he told Merle there was nothing further his office could do without a specimen or unambiguous photographic evidence. No one lied to Merle. No one suppressed anything. The system simply was not built to process what Merle handed it, and the officer's own career, his standing with his supervisors, and his credibility with the ranching community he serves would all have been put at unnecessary risk by pursuing a case his own database told him could not exist. That is the quiet mechanism by which encounters like this one disappear from any official record almost as soon as they happen, not through malice, but through the ordinary, rational self-interest of professionals operating inside a system with no room for the exception in front of them. The ethical weight of what Merle is now sitting on is not small, and he has wrestled with it more than he initially let on to us. He has, sitting in his phone and in a folder of printed photographs in his gun safe, evidence of an encounter that, if it became public in any verified way, would very likely bring exactly the kind of attention to his farm and his family that neither he nor, he strongly suspects, the animals that live somewhere in that drainage corridor would welcome. Hunters would come, thrill seekers with rifles and night vision optics would descend on a stretch of quiet farm country that has functioned, by whatever arrangement exists between the humans who farm it and whatever moves through the timber along the creek, as a place where both parties have largely left each other alone for generations. Merle has decided, deliberately and after a great deal of thought, that he is not going to be the reason that arrangement ends. He has told his hunting buddy and his veterinarian and, now, us, and that is where the circle stops. His children know the broad outline, his granddaughter does not know any of it, and Merle intends to keep it that way for as long as he can manage. What Merle keeps coming back to, more than the fear, more than the roof he had to replace, more even than the strangeness of what he saw, is the plain fact of the thing itself, something dying, in more pain than Merle has ever personally witnessed in any animal, used what little life it had left to warn a stranger's family away from danger it had somehow anticipated before the National Weather Service had the data to issue a warning of its own. Whatever that animal was, wherever it came from, whatever biological category eventually gets assigned to it if science ever catches up to what farmers along the Pennyroyal Plateau have quietly known for generations, it made a choice, in its final minutes, that had nothing to do with its own survival, and everything to do with Merle's family surviving instead. Merle does not know what that means about the creature's intentions toward humans generally. He is careful, when he talks about this, not to romanticize something he understands could just as easily be dangerous under different circumstances. And he has not forgotten that whatever species this belongs to has, according to the Extension Office's old case files, been implicated in unexplained cattle losses along this same drainage for decades. He holds both of those things at once without trying to resolve them into a tidier story than the facts support. Something in that field bottom is capable of killing livestock quietly and efficiently when it needs to. And something in that field bottom, on one particular morning in late September, chose instead to spend its last strength keeping a family it had never met from dying in a storm. He told us the last time we spoke that he still walks down to that sycamore near the creek sometimes, in full daylight, and stands where the blood pool was, long since washed away by 2 years of rain, and he does not know what he is looking for when he does it. He said maybe he is just saying thank you, in the only way he knows how, to something that never asked for anything back. The storm passed through Todd County years ago now. The roof is new, the barn is rebuilt, and somewhere down along the sinking fork, in timber that has sheltered whatever this is for longer than any deed or survey has ever accounted for, something is still out there, still watching a farm that keeps its distance after dark out of something that might be fear and might be a debt nobody has found the words to repay. There is more to this story than what Merle found in the field and what the storm survey confirmed afterward, and getting the fuller picture required going back to Merle a second time, weeks after our first conversation, once he had decided he was willing to talk about the parts he had left out the first time because he was not sure anyone would believe them, even after believing the rest. The first thing he had held back was what happened on Highway 80 itself, the 2-lane state road that runs along the northern edge of his property between Elkton and Hopkinsville. Kentucky State Police maintains a barracks in Hopkinsville covering that stretch of road, and vehicle-animal collision reports in rural Kentucky counties are filed as a matter of routine, usually involving deer, sometimes livestock that has gotten through a fence, occasionally a coyote or a dog. Merle, once he started asking around after his conversation with the conservation officer, contacted a trooper he has known socially for years through the volunteer fire department both men belonged to, and asked, off the record, whether there had been any reported vehicle strikes on that stretch of road the same night as the storm. There had been one. A single vehicle report filed just before 3 in the morning by a driver heading east toward Hopkinsville, who told the responding trooper that he had struck what he described as a large animal, possibly an elk or an escaped livestock animal, crossing the highway in his headlights. The driver's front bumper and one headlight assembly were damaged. He told the trooper the animal had gotten back up after the impact and moved off the roadway into the field on the south side, meaning Merle's side, before he could get a clear look at it or pull over safely on the narrow shoulder. The trooper's report, which Merle's contact described to him but did not show him directly, listed the animal as unidentified, likely elk given occasional reports of escaped exotic livestock from a game farm operation several miles to the north, and closed the file without further investigation, since no human injury had occurred, and Kentucky does not require follow-up on unidentified wildlife strikes absent a fatality or significant property damage claim. That report puts a hard time stamp on the sequence of events. Something struck by a vehicle on Highway 80, just before 3 in the morning, injured badly enough to damage a car's front end and headlight, got back up, and by some accounting of distance and the animal's evident difficulty moving, made its way roughly 1/3 of a mile south, across open pasture, to the exact spot in Merle's lower field, where he found it just over 2 hours later, sometime after 5. 2 hours of dragging itself, on legs that were failing, toward the nearest human dwelling it was aware of, arriving close enough to that dwelling to make its warning gesture legible and be heard, all while a squall line that would eventually produce 80-mile-an-hour wind was organizing on the radar less than an hour out. Merle did not know about the vehicle strike report when he first spoke to us. Learning about it afterward changed his understanding of the timeline in a way he says still keeps him up some nights. He had assumed, without really examining the assumption, that whatever he found had simply been badly injured somewhere nearby, and had wandered or been carried to that spot. Knowing now that it had been struck by a car on a public highway and had then deliberately traveled, in a dying condition, specifically toward his house rather than toward the timber along the creek, which would have been the shorter end. For an injured animal seeking cover, the more obviously sensible direction reframes the entire encounter. The timber was closer. The creek was closer. Whatever was moving that night chose the harder path toward people instead of the easier path toward safety. The second thing Merle held back initially involved a neighbor, an older man who farms the adjoining property to the east and who Merle has known his entire life, close enough in age and history that the two families have helped each other through harvests, funerals, and hard years for generations. We are not using any name for this neighbor at all, at Merle's insistence, referring to him only by his relationship to Merle, because the man is in his 80s, deeply private, and made it clear through Merle that he wanted no part of being identified even by a changed first name. This neighbor, when Merle finally worked up the nerve to ask him directly, admitted that he had experienced something similar decades earlier, in the late 1970s, on the same general stretch of the sinking fork drainage, though on a different section of the creek further downstream. He told Merle that his own father, working cattle along that creek bottom one winter evening, had come across a large animal track in fresh snow that he could not identify, canine in shape but far too large, with a stride he described using almost the identical language Merle used decades later without either man having heard the other's account beforehand. Since Merle had never told this neighbor about his own encounter until specifically asking him about the family history. The neighbor's father, according to family recollection passed down informally, had refused to discuss it beyond that single mention, and had told his own son only that there were things along that creek a man was better off not going looking for. A piece of advice, the neighbor said his father repeated more than once over the years without ever elaborating further. That kind of quiet, undocumented, single-generation transmission of a warning, never elevated to a formal story, never written down, never shared outside the immediate family, until circumstances forced it into the open, is exactly the pattern researchers, who study this phenomenon across other regions, have described repeatedly. It does not look like folklore in the traditional sense, with an elaborate narrative and a moral. It looks like a caution passed quietly between people who trust each other, stripped down to the essential practical advice. Stay away from a specific stretch of ground after dark, without any explanation attached, because the people passing the warning along either did not have one or did not think it was necessary to give one. The retired extension agent deserves a proper introduction, because his professional background is a large part of why Merle trusted his assessment at all. He spent close to 30 years as the livestock and agronomy agent for the Todd County office of the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service, earning his degree in animal science from the University of Kentucky in the late 1970s, before returning to his home county to spend his entire career working directly with local cattle and tobacco operations. Part of his job, for decades, involved responding to unexplained livestock losses, documenting necropsy findings for insurance and disease surveillance purposes, and serving as the frontline professional most local farmers called first whenever something happened to their herd that they could not explain themselves. He was, by every account Merle and others in the county offered, meticulous, cautious, and not given to speculation, which is precisely why his willingness to show Merle a 30-year-old notebook entry he had deliberately kept out of his official paperwork carries the weight it does. The third and, to Merle, the most unsettling piece of information he uncovered came from this retired county extension agent, whose old case files documented the unexplained cattle deaths from the early 1990s. When Merle sat down with this retired agent, a man in his 70s now living in a small house just outside Elkton, and showed him the photographs from his own encounter, the man was quiet for a long time before saying something Merle has not been able to shake since. He said that in 1993, during his investigation into one of the cattle deaths on a farm along the same drainage, he had found, in addition to the puncture wound on the animal's throat that his necropsy notes describe, a partial track in the mud near the carcass that he had measured and sketched in his personal field notebook, but never included in his official report to the extension office. because he knew exactly how it would be received by his supervisors and did not want his professional judgment questioned over what he assumed. At the time, must have been some kind of measurement error or a track distorted by mud. He still had that notebook. He showed it to Merle, the sketch, allowing for 30 years of a non-professional's hand-drawn approximation, showed a print with the same general proportions and the same unusual toe spread that Merle had photographed near the sycamore. 3 men, across 3 decades, on the same short stretch of Kentucky Creek bottom, each independently deciding the truth of what they had found was not something they could safely put into an official record, and each keeping that decision to themselves until circumstances, or in Merle's case, a storm and a dying animal's last act of what looked very much like mercy, forced the subject into the open, going back over the encounter itself in more detail than Merle offered the first time. Once trust had built between us over several conversations, fills in physical detail that matters for anyone trying to understand exactly what was down in that field. Merle estimated the animal's weight, based on the depth of the drag marks it left in soft ground and the amount of displaced soil along the path from the sycamore, at somewhere between 300 and 400 pounds, heavier than any black bear documented in Kentucky, where the state's bear population, still recovering from near extirpation in the 20th century, and now slowly recolonizing the eastern counties from source populations in Tennessee and West Virginia, rarely produces adult males over 350 pounds, even in prime eastern mountain habitat, let alone in the flatter Pennyroyal region, where bears are still uncommon transients rather than an established population. The chest, even collapsed in the wet grass, struck Merle as disproportionately deep relative to the animal's apparent height, giving it a barrel-like quality through the torso that he has struggled to compare to anything else he has handled or observed in decades of livestock work, though the closest comparison he could offer was the chest depth on a mature Angus bull relative to its overall frame, scaled onto a body built for standing upright. The fur, examined as closely as Merle got in the limited time and light available, was coarse and dense, closer in texture to a wild boar's bristle than to a dog's softer coat, though matted heavily with mud and blood in a way that made a confident assessment difficult. The color, in flashlight illumination, read as a very dark brown shading to black, though Merle is careful to note that flashlight beams distort color perception significantly, and he would not swear to the exact shade in daylight conditions. The hands, or what functioned as hands on the forelimbs, were the detail that Merle keeps returning to with the most specificity, because it is the detail that convinced him this was not simply an oversized canine of some undocumented type. The digits were long, 5 per limb as far as he could tell in the brief window before the animal used that limb for its gesture, with visible articulation at what would be knuckle joints on a human hand, and a thumb that appeared capable of opposing the other digits, based on the way the animal gripped and released the air during its pushing motion. A true canid forelimb, no matter how large, does not produce that kind of articulated grasping motion. Wolves, coyotes, and domestic dogs all share a forelimb structure built around running and stability rather than manipulation. What Merle watched reaching toward him in that field was built for something else entirely, a limb capable of the kind of fine directional gesture that, according to both the veterinarian and the retired extension agent Merle eventually consulted, would require a level of hand structure and neurological control that simply does not exist in any large predator native to North America. The vocalization deserves its own close examination as well, because Merle has thought about almost nothing else as intently in the time since. He described the 3-tone sequence as beginning low, almost below the edge of what he could comfortably hear, rising through a middle register that had a rough, almost gravelly quality to it, and then dropping again before repeating. He compared the overall effect, more than once, to the sound a large diesel engine makes when it first turns over on a cold morning. That specific rolling, uneven catch before it settles into a steady idle, except vocalized rather than mechanical, and carrying an unmistakable urgency in its rhythm that Merle, a man who has spent his life reading the moods of animals under stress, recognized instantly as distress directed outward rather than distress experienced internally, not a wounded animal crying out in pain for its own sake. A wounded animal trying, with whatever communicative tools it had left, to convey specific information to another party capable of receiving it. The retired extension agent, when Merle described the vocalization to him in detail, said it reminded him of something his own father, a coon hunter who ran hounds along that same creek bottom in the 1960s, used to describe hearing on rare occasions late at night, a sound his father called a talking bark, distinct from anything the hounds themselves produced, structured in a way that made the old man swear something out there was saying something to something else, even though he could never explain what that meant in any more specific terms. That detail had never been written down anywhere. It existed only as a family story the extension agent had heard secondhand from his own father decades earlier, and it had never once occurred to him to connect it to his own professional case files until Merle sat across his kitchen table, describing an experience the agent immediately recognized, on some level, as belonging to the same unacknowledged category of local knowledge that has apparently been passing quietly between generations of Todd County families for a very long time, without ever being formally recorded anywhere official. The broader geographic and ecological picture around Fort Campbell deserves attention here too, because it shapes the human presence in this part of southern Kentucky in ways that matter to understanding why an animal population like this could persist undetected. Fort Campbell, home to the 101st Airborne Division, straddles the Kentucky and Tennessee border roughly 25 miles southwest of Merle's farm, and the installation itself covers over 100,000 acres, much of it maintained as undeveloped training land, forest, and restricted airspace, rather than built infrastructure. Nighttime helicopter training operations out of Fort Campbell are common and well known to residents throughout this part of Christian and Todd counties. Low-altitude flights that residents have grown so accustomed to that most no longer notice them. Merle mentioned, almost as an aside during one of our later conversations, that on the night of the storm, before the lightning built to the point where he could no longer distinguish individual sounds, he thought he had heard, faintly and from a distance, the particular rotor signature of a military helicopter, a sound familiar to anyone who has lived near Fort Campbell for any length of time, moving somewhere to the south. He does not know if this is relevant to anything. He mentions it only because he has committed to giving as complete and honest an account of that night as he can reconstruct, and it is one more data point in an evening that already had more moving pieces, human and otherwise, than any single farmer's testimony could fully account for on its own. What that proximity to a major military installation does provide, regardless of whether it connects directly to anything Merle experienced, is one more layer of explanation for how a large, elusive animal population could maintain itself across this stretch of southern Kentucky for generations without triggering the kind of sustained, documented investigation that a suburban or heavily trafficked rural area would produce. Large sections of land around Fort Campbell's training areas are subject to restricted civilian access, low-altitude noise that would mask a great deal of animal activity from casual observation, and a resident population long accustomed to treating unusual nighttime sounds as military rather than biological in origin. An animal moving through the margins of that airspace and that training ground, using the same waterway corridors that connect to the land between the lake system to the west, would have access to tens of thousands of additional acres of low-disturbance ground on top of the farm country and cave systems already discussed. There is a piece of this story that took the longest for Merle to share, and it came out almost by accident, near the end of our third conversation, when he mentioned in passing that the Todd County Sheriff's Office had also briefly been involved. What happened was this. A different neighbor, a woman who lives about a mile north of Merle along Highway 80, called the sheriff's office 2 days after the storm to report that something had gotten into her chicken coop overnight, killing 4 birds without eating any of them, and had bent the welded wire fencing around the coop in a way she could not explain. Since raccoons and possums, the usual chicken coop culprits in that part of Kentucky, do not have the strength to bend heavy-gauge welded wire, and coyotes, while capable of killing chickens efficiently, typically do not leave the carcasses behind uneaten. A deputy came out, took a report for insurance purposes since she wanted to file a claim on the damaged coop through her homeowner's policy, and noted in his report, according to what Merle was later able to learn through his contact at the sheriff's office, that the damage to the fencing was consistent with something considerably stronger than any documented local predator, without offering any further speculation, because that is exactly as far as a sheriff's deputy's job description extends on a call like that. Property damage report filed. Insurance claim processed. No further action, because there was no crime to investigate and no agency whose job it was to identify an animal outside the department's jurisdiction and expertise. Merle spoke to that neighbor directly, once he had worked up the nerve to ask around the area more broadly, and she told him plainly that she had never seen anything, only the aftermath, and that she had no interest in speculating about what did it beyond what she'd already told the deputy. Her exact words to Merle, which he repeated to us because they stuck with him, were that whatever bent that fence wasn't hungry, it was just making a point, and that she'd rather not think too hard about what kind of animal makes a point like that. The timing put that incident at roughly 2 days after Merle's own encounter, and the location, a mile north along the same highway, sits almost exactly along the path, an animal moving between the sinking fork drainage and whatever territory it uses further north would be expected to travel. Merle does not know if this was the same animal, injured and desperate for an easy meal in a weakened state, or a different individual from whatever social group had come to retrieve the body from his field days earlier. He leans toward the second explanation, given how quickly it happened, and given his growing understanding that this is not a solitary animal, but part of some kind of group with a presence spanning at least this stretch of the sinking fork corridor. Whichever explanation is correct, it establishes that whatever moved through Merle's field that September did not represent an isolated, one-time visitor passing through. It represents an established, if small, resident population using this specific stretch of Todd County on an ongoing basis, doing so well enough and quietly enough that a chicken coop incident 2 days after the biggest personal event of Merle's life, registered with the sheriff's office as nothing more than an unusually strong predator, filed and forgotten within the week. This is the detail that, more than anything else, convinced Merle that what happened to him was not an isolated miracle, but a single data point inside a much larger and much older pattern that the people who farm this stretch of Kentucky have been quietly navigating around for generations without ever naming it directly. Every farmer along the sinking fork has a story, or a father's story, or a story about a neighbor's cattle, filed away under some other explanation, because that was always the safer thing to do with it. Merle's story is different only in the sense that it came with a verified, external, meteorologically documented consequence attached to it. A family that would very likely not be alive today, or would at minimum be dealing with catastrophic injury, had they stayed in that house. That verification is what pulled his story out of the category every other story in this drainage has occupied for decades, and into something Merle felt he could no longer simply file away and never speak of again. Carrying that distinction has settled into Merle's daily life in ways that go beyond the sleeplessness and the avoidance of the lower field after dark that we described earlier. His relationship with his own land has changed in a way that took months for him to even begin to articulate. He told us, during our last conversation, that he used to think of that 400 acres as entirely his, in the straightforward way any farmer thinks of ground his family has worked and paid taxes on for 3 generations. He does not think of it that way anymore. He thinks of it now as land he shares, in an arrangement he never negotiated and cannot fully explain, with an animal that has apparently been living alongside his family's farming operation for at least as long as his own family has owned the property, quietly enough that 3 generations of his family farmed that ground without ever needing to acknowledge the arrangement directly, until one storm and one dying animal's final act forced the acknowledgement into the open. That reframing has caused real friction inside his own family. Friction Merle was reluctant to discuss at first, but eventually did, because he said the story would not be honest without it. His son, the one working construction in Hopkinsville, has told Merle more than once that he thinks his father should sell the lower field, the specific swale and creek bottom acreage where the encounter happened, to a neighboring operation, and keep the rest of the farm, on the theory that whatever risk exists is concentrated in that specific ground, and separating from it would eliminate the exposure entirely. Merle has refused, each time the subject comes up, and the refusal has become a low simmering point of disagreement between father and son that neither man has fully resolved. Merle's reasoning, when he finally explained it to us, was not primarily financial, though selling off bottomland that floods regularly and produces mediocre hay would make little financial sense on its own. His reasoning was that the animal that dragged itself across a third of a mile of open pasture to warn his family, using its last living strength to do so, deserves better from him than being treated as a liability to offload onto whoever would buy the ground next. A buyer who would have no idea what they were purchasing alongside the acreage and no reason to extend the same quiet forbearance Merle's family has apparently extended, whether knowingly or not, for 3 generations. His daughter, the nursing student, has taken a different position entirely, one that surprised Merle when she first offered it. She told him, during one of the family conversations that happened in the weeks after the storm, that she thought the encounter should change how the family thinks about that land's purpose rather than whether they keep it. She suggested, half seriously at first, and then with growing conviction as the idea sat with her, that the family formally set aside the lower field and the creek-bottom timber as an informal wildlife buffer, never grazed, never hunted, left entirely alone, without any law or agency requiring it, but as a deliberate acknowledgement of what her father believes he owes to whatever is out there. Merle has not fully committed to that plan, but he has, in practice, stopped grazing cattle in that field entirely since the encounter, which functions as roughly the same outcome, without the formal declaration his daughter proposed. It is worth stepping back at this point and placing what happened to Merle inside the wider body of Dogman reporting that has built up over the past 4 decades, because the consistency across cases separated by enormous distances and long stretches of time is, on its own, one of the stronger arguments for taking this seriously, rather than dismissing it as one farmer's isolated misperception under stressful conditions. Linda Godfrey began documenting these encounters in the early 1990s after her initial newspaper reporting on the so-called Beast of Bray Road in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, and over 3 decades of subsequent research she collected and cross-referenced cases from across the Great Lakes region, and eventually, from a much wider geographic spread stretching into Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, and the Upper South. What her research established, methodically and case by case, was a behavioral profile that repeats itself with striking consistency regardless of region. Bipedal posture with a documented capacity to drop to a quadrupedal gait for speed. A canine head profile with an elongated muzzle and erect, pointed ears, distinct from any known North American wolf or dog morphology. Nocturnal activity concentrated around dawn and dusk transition hours. A strong association with water sources, whether rivers, creek bottoms, or wetlands, and, most relevant to Merle's specific case, documented instances across her collected files of witnesses describing behavior that read as deliberately restrained or, in rarer cases, that seemed to carry some form of communicative intent rather than pure predatory calculation. Steve Cook, the radio disc jockey in Traverse City, Michigan, who wrote and recorded a novelty song called The Legend as an April Fool's Joke in 1987, unintentionally became one of the most important catalysts in the modern documentation of this phenomenon. His song was not accurate in any specific factual sense, since he has been open for decades that he invented the details from whole cloth without any prior research into existing reports. What mattered was that broadcasting it triggered an overwhelming response from listeners across Michigan, who called the station describing encounters that predated the song by years or decades, encounters they had never previously felt comfortable sharing with anyone. The song did not create a phenomenon. It created a temporary permission structure that allowed people who had been carrying silent, unshared experiences to finally speak, and what came pouring in once that permission existed described the same creature, the same behavior, and the same reluctance to be believed that Godfrey would go on to document formally over the following decades. Kentucky occupies a strange gap in this broader body of documentation, and it is worth being honest about why rather than manufacturing a false sense of established local tradition that does not exist. Unlike Wisconsin, Michigan, or even parts of the Ohio Valley further north, Kentucky does not have a long-running, well-known regional dogman reporting tradition on the scale of Bray Road or the Michigan cases. What Kentucky has instead, and what this specific case adds to, is a scattered, largely undocumented set of individual family stories, agricultural anomalies, and quietly kept secrets, exactly the kind Merle uncovered when he started asking his own neighbors direct questions for the first time in his life. That absence of a well-known regional tradition does not mean the phenomenon does not exist here. It may mean the opposite, that a population moving through cave systems and river corridors across a region with a lower population density and a farming culture built around discretion and self-reliance has simply been more successful at staying out of the cave system public record than populations further north, where dense forest recreation and a stronger existing folklore tradition created more opportunities for encounters to surface and be shared. Kentucky does have one well-known cryptid tradition, and it is worth addressing directly precisely because it is not the same phenomenon and should not be confused with what happened to Merle. The Pope Lick Monster, a goatman figure said to live beneath a railroad trestle over Pope Lick Creek on the outskirts of Louisville, has been part of local urban legend since at least the mid-20th century, and remains widely known across the state, discussed in local newspapers and documented by folklorists studying Kentucky legend traditions. The Pope Lick figure is described consistently as part man and part goat, associated with a single specific trestle rather than a broad territory, and functions in local tradition more as a cautionary tale, warning teenagers away from a genuinely dangerous active railroad structure than as a documented wildlife encounter pattern. It shares almost nothing in common with what Merle experienced beyond both belonging, broadly, to the category of unexplained large creature reports. The distinction matters because it would be easy, and dishonest, to blur the two together simply because both are Kentucky stories. What Merle encountered bears no resemblance to a goat man haunting a specific trestle. It bears every resemblance to the upright canine morphology, the territorial range behavior, and the documented restraint pattern that Godfrey's decades of Great Lakes research established as a distinct and internally consistent phenomenon, one that happens to have left a much thinner paper trail in Kentucky than it has further north, for reasons of geography and culture, rather than because the animals themselves are any less present here. The scientific plausibility of the storm anticipation behavior Merle witnessed deserves one more pass, because it is the single detail in this entire account that a skeptical viewer is most likely to seize on as the weak point, and it deserves to be addressed directly and honestly rather than glossed over. Animal sensitivity to approaching severe weather is not fringe science. It is well-established, published, peer-reviewed territory. Barometric pressure drops ahead of a squall line or a low-pressure system are detectable by inner ear structures present across many vertebrate species, and there is a substantial and growing body of research into biological detection of infrasound, the extremely low-frequency acoustic energy generated by severe convective storms and tornadoes that travels enormous distances through both the atmosphere and the ground, often preceding the arrival of the visible storm system by significant margins. None of that research, to be clear, extends to documenting a large, undiscovered North American predator species with this capability, because no such species has been formally documented at all. But the underlying biological mechanism Merle's account implies, heightened barometric or infrasonic sensitivity in a large, long-lived apex predator that has survived for generations in a region regularly hit by severe convective weather, is not a violation of any known biological principle. It would, in fact, be exactly the kind of adaptation natural selection would favor in precisely this environment. Over however many generations this population has occupied the Pennyroyal Plateau. What natural selection does not obviously explain, and what pushes this specific case past simple animal instinct into territory that unsettled every person Merle eventually confided in, is the decision to act on that sensitivity in a way that prioritized a stranger's safety over the animal's own. An animal with heightened storm sensitivity uses that sensitivity to save itself, moving to shelter, seeking higher ground, behaving the way cattle and wild deer are well documented to behave hours ahead of severe weather. What Merle witnessed was an animal already mortally injured, already beyond any benefit that fleeing the storm itself could have provided. using its last capacity for movement and communication not to save itself, which was no longer possible, but to alert a family it had, as far as anyone can determine, no prior direct relationship with, unless you count 3 generations of a farming family, and whatever population of these creatures has shared that same 400 acres as a relationship built slowly across decades of mutual, unacknowledged coexistence. That is the piece of this account that Merle keeps returning to. More than the fear, more than the strangeness of the creature's appearance, more even than the financial cost of the storm damage. Something that had every biological and situational excuse to simply die quietly in a field, having already lost whatever this encounter cost it on a public highway hours earlier, chose instead to spend its final reserve of strength, making sure a family it had likely watched from a distance for years, without that family ever knowing, survived a threat. It alone among all of them had the capacity to detect in time. The academic side of this equation is worth examining too, because Kentucky is home to several universities with active wildlife biology and conservation programs, and it would be reasonable for a viewer to ask why none of them have ever picked up on a pattern like the one Merle uncovered. Murray State University, in the far western part of the state, runs a well-regarded wildlife and conservation biology program with faculty who publish regularly on regional predator populations, including ongoing coyote and black bear range expansion studies across western Kentucky. Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, where Merle's own daughter is finishing her degree in an unrelated field, similarly maintains an active biology department with faculty research interests in regional mammal populations. Neither institution, as far as any records Merle or we were able to locate show, has ever published anything referencing unexplained large predator sign in the Pennyroyal region specifically. That absence is not evidence that nothing is there. It is evidence of how academic wildlife biology actually functions as a discipline, which is considerably more conservative and considerably more career risk-averse than popular understanding of scientific inquiry generally assumes. A junior faculty member building a career on tenure-track research does not spend limited grant funding and limited publishing bandwidth chasing anecdotal farmer reports of an unidentified predator that does not appear in any peer-reviewed baseline survey of the region's known fauna. Doing so risks being labeled, fairly or not, as someone chasing cryptozoology rather than serious wildlife science, a reputational risk that can follow a young academic for the rest of a career built on peer respect and grant committee approval. Established, tenured faculty with more professional security to spare have their own research programs already funded and running, built around species and questions that already have institutional support and existing literature to build on. Nobody in that system has a straightforward professional incentive to be the first person to formally investigate a claim like Merle's, and every one of them has a clear professional incentive to avoid it. That is the same mechanism operating at the university level that Merle already encountered at the state wildlife agency level, and at the county sheriff and extension office level before that. Different institutions, different specific reasons, identical outcome. The evidence goes nowhere, not because anyone is hiding it, but because every single professional who touches it has more to lose than to gain by pursuing it seriously. The ethical dimension of what Merle is now sitting on runs deeper than the simple question of whether to talk publicly, and he has thought about it from angles that go beyond his own family's safety and privacy. He has thought, at length, about what would actually happen to the population of animals living along the sinking fork drainage if this story became widely known and verified in a way that could not be dismissed. Todd County is agricultural, low density, and largely unprotected by any formal conservation designation beyond ordinary state forest and wildlife management area, boundaries that sit well to the east and west of his specific farm. There is no institutional barrier, no national forest boundary, no wilderness designation standing between a viral verified Dogman story and a flood of armed, curious, or simply reckless visitors descending on a stretch of quiet private farmland that has functioned for at least 3 generations, and probably much longer, as a place where an unusual and highly intelligent predator population and a small number of farming families have maintained an unspoken arrangement of mutual avoidance and, in Merle's case, apparently something closer to mutual regard. Merle has weighed that risk against the opposite consideration, the one that occasionally keeps him awake for entirely different reasons. If this population exists, and if it is capable of the kind of behavior he witnessed, there may be genuine value, purely from a public safety standpoint, in wildlife agencies having accurate information about what shares this landscape with the farming families who work it. He has gone back and forth on this more times than he can count, and he has landed, for now, on the same conclusion the Coast Range logger and the Umatilla depot contractor and other similar accounts eventually reached. The system, as it currently exists, has no capacity to receive this information responsibly. A formal report would not result in careful, protective wildlife management. It would result, most likely, in exactly the kind of exposure that puts both his family and whatever lives along that creek at greater risk than the current arrangement of quiet, unofficial coexistence already manages reasonably well on its own. One more piece of outside professional opinion found its way into Merle's investigation, and it came from a direction he did not expect. Faye mentioned the encounter, carefully and in general terms, to a colleague at the elementary school whose husband works as an occupational therapist in Hopkinsville, specializing in hand and upper limb rehabilitation for patients recovering from strokes and traumatic injuries. Faye, more out of curiosity than any real expectation of a useful answer, asked her colleague whether her husband would be willing to look at Merle's photographs of the drag marks and the partial handprint impressions found near the fallen log along the trail. Merle followed after the initial track discovery. Years earlier, the same set of prints the retired extension agent had also examined. The therapist agreed, on the condition that he not be named or connected to this story in any identifiable way, given his own professional standing in a small regional medical community. He looked at the photographs for a long time, Faye told us, and asked several clarifying questions about scale and substrate before offering an opinion. He said the spacing and depth pattern of the finger impressions suggested a grip strength and a range of digit independence considerably beyond what any non-primate mammal is built to produce, closer in mechanical terms to what he would expect from a large ape's hand than from any canine paw structure, regardless of the animal's overall size. He was careful to add that he could not make any claim about species identification from a photograph of ground impressions, and that his opinion was offered strictly as a professional observation about the biomechanics implied by the print pattern. Nothing more. But it lined up, without either man ever discussing the case with each other, with what the retired extension agent had said about his own 30-year-old field sketch, and it lined up with what Merle himself had observed directly in the field about the articulated, thumb-opposed gesture the dying animal made toward his house. 3 separate professionals, a wildlife extension agent, a large animal veterinarian, and an occupational therapist specializing in human hand function, each looking at a different piece of physical evidence from this case in isolation, each reaching independently toward the same conclusion. Whatever left those prints and made that gesture had a forelimb built for manipulation and communication in a way that goes well beyond anything in the standard North American predator catalog, and every one of them arrived at that conclusion from a different professional angle, without any of them comparing notes with each other beforehand. There is a final piece of testimony that belongs in this account, one that came from Merle's own granddaughter, the 7-year-old girl who slept through the entire episode in the back of Merle's truck without ever waking, and who to this day has no knowledge of what her grandfather found in the field that night. Merle told us that in the 2 years since the storm, on 3 separate occasions, all of them during daylight visits to the farm, the girl has mentioned, unprompted and without any apparent concern, that she saw a big dog watching her from the tree line while she was playing near the house. Each time, Merle or Faye asked her to describe it, gently and without alarming her. And each time she described something tall, standing like a person, with a face like a dog, standing very still at the edge of the trees, and simply watching before walking away. Each time, an adult in the family redirected her attention elsewhere and did not press further. Out of a shared instinct neither Merle nor Faye has ever discussed directly with each other, an instinct that says some things are better left as a child's passing observation about a big dog in the yard than as the beginning of a conversation. neither of them is prepared to have with a 7-year-old about what actually happened the night the storm took the roof off their house. Merle has never seen the animal his granddaughter describes himself, not since the night in the field. He does not know if it is the same population, watching from a respectful distance, checking on the family at once. In some capacity, neither Merle nor anyone else fully understands, chose to protect. He does not know if there is any connection at all beyond a child's imagination and the ordinary presence of large dogs and coyotes that any rural Kentucky property attracts from time to time. What he knows, and what he told us mattered more to him than almost anything else in this entire account, is that whatever his granddaughter is seeing at the tree line has never once frightened her, not on any of the 3 occasions she has mentioned it, and that whatever her small, unguarded description amounts to, it has never once made her want to stop playing in that yard. Once Merle's elderly neighbor agreed to share more of what he knew about his own father's encounter, decades removed from the man who lived it, and filtered through a lifetime of the son's own careful reluctance to discuss it. A fuller picture of that 1970s incident finally came into focus, and it deserves to be told in more detail than the brief mention it received earlier, because it is the second strongest piece of testimony gathered for this account, and it belongs where it lands hardest, in the middle of this story rather than tucked away at the edges. The neighbor's father, a cattleman working that same creek bottom in the winter of 1976, had gone down to check on a group of bred heifers during an evening snow, carrying a lantern rather than a flashlight, since battery-powered lights were less reliable and more expensive for a working farmer in that era than a good kerosene lantern that never failed in cold weather. He found the heifers bunched tight against a fence corner, agitated and refusing to settle, the way cattle behave when a predator is nearby, even if the predator itself is not visible. He walked the fence line looking for the cause, lantern held high, and came across a track in the fresh snow that stopped him the same way Merle's track stopped him decades later. Large, canine in general shape, but with a stride length, the old man measured against his own boot prints and found impossible to reconcile with any animal he had ever tracked in a lifetime of hunting and farming that same creek bottom. He followed the tracks a short distance, the neighbor told Merle, relaying a story his father had told exactly once, late at night, after several drinks, during a rare moment when the old man's usual reticence broke down enough to let the story out. The tracks led along the fence line and then simply stopped at the edge of a small sinkhole depression, one of the countless karst features that pock this landscape, where the snow showed clear disturbance, suggesting the animal had descended into the opening rather than continuing across open ground. The old man did not follow it down. He told his son, in that single unguarded telling, that he stood at the edge of that sinkhole for a long time, lantern held out over the opening, and that something down in the dark had made a sound back up at him, low and structured, that he could not describe except to say it did not sound like anything that belonged underground in Kentucky limestone country, and that it did not sound entirely unlike a person trying to speak through a mouth that was not built for human speech. He went home that night, said nothing to his wife beyond a vague mention of predator sign near the cattle, and never spoke of it again to anyone outside that single late-night telling to his own son years later. He did, however, according to the neighbor, quietly and without explanation, stop grazing that specific section of bottomland. For the remaining 2 decades he farmed that ground, rotating his cattle around it rather than through it, a decision his son inherited, without ever being given a reason for it beyond his father, simply saying that ground was better left alone. That story, sitting quietly inside one family for close to 50 years, never told outside that single household, until Merle's own encounter gave the neighbor a reason to finally share it, describes the same essential elements Merle experienced independently and without any prior knowledge of his neighbor's family history. A large, canine-shaped track with an impossible stride, a vocalization that reads as structured rather than random, and a decision made independently by 2 different farming families across 2 different generations to simply withdraw from a specific piece of ground, rather than attempt to understand or confront whatever was making that ground unsafe to graze after dark. The sinkhole the old man's tracks led to, according to the neighbor, who still knows the general location from childhood memory even though the specific depression has partially filled in over the decades, sits less than half a mile from the sycamore, where Merle found his own blood trail, terminating in a second set of tracks that came from the timber. That distance, on a stretch of creek bottom that runs for miles in either direction, is close enough that it is difficult to treat as coincidental. Whatever den system or underground network this population uses, and Merle's growing conviction that the karst geology beneath this entire stretch of the Pennyroyal Plateau provides exactly the kind of subterranean shelter and movement corridor that would let a large, elusive predator population persist here for generations without ever needing to be seen on the surface for extended periods, finds its clearest supporting evidence in these two accounts sitting less than a half-mile apart and separated by nearly 50 years. Stepping back from the individual pieces of testimony to look at the behavior as a whole, what accumulates across Merle's own encounter? The highway strike report, the chicken coop incident a mile north, the extension agent's 30-year-old field notebook, and the neighbor's father's account from 1976 is a picture of an animal population operating with a level of situational awareness and restraint that goes well beyond anything documented in known North American predator behavior, while remaining entirely consistent with the broader Dogman behavioral profile that researchers have documented across other regions for decades. One additional detail from the highway strike report deserves a closer look before moving into that synthesis, because it changes how the encounter's opening minutes should be understood. The driver who struck the animal near 3 in the morning told the responding trooper that in the instant before impact, he believed he saw a second, smaller shape at the tree line on the opposite shoulder, standing upright and motionless, watching the road. He did not mention this detail as significant at the time, since his attention was entirely on the animal directly in his headlights and on getting his damaged vehicle stopped safely on a narrow shoulder in the dark, and the trooper's report reflects it only as a brief, uncertain aside, rather than a documented observation. But if that second shape was real, and if it belonged to the same population that later came for the body near the sycamore, it means the animal that was struck may not have been traveling alone that night, and that whatever social unit it belonged to may have witnessed the collision itself, hours before any of them arrived at Merle's field to retrieve what was left. Consider what did not happen across any of these accounts, because the absence of certain behaviors is as informative as the presence of others. No human being across any of these incidents, spanning close to 5 decades along this single stretch of creek bottom, was ever attacked, threatened, or even directly approached in a way that suggested predatory intent toward a person. The chicken coop incident involved livestock, not people, and even there, the birds were killed but not consumed, behavior more consistent with a territorial message or a response to some perceived threat than with straightforward predation for food. The 1976 encounter ended with the animal retreating underground, rather than approaching the farmer at the sinkhole's edge, despite having every opportunity, in near total darkness with a single elderly man carrying nothing but a lantern, to close that distance, if predatory aggression toward humans were part of its behavioral repertoire. And Merle's own encounter, the most direct and sustained contact any human in this account had with the animal, ended with the creature using its remaining strength not to defend itself or flee from Merle's presence, but to communicate a warning that had nothing to do with itself at all. That consistency across decades and across multiple independent witnesses who never compared notes with each other until circumstances forced. The comparison describes behavior that goes beyond simple animal caution around humans, which is well documented in wolves, coyotes, and black bears, and which typically manifests as straightforward avoidance rather than active, directed communication. What this population appears to demonstrate, based on the accumulated evidence from this one small stretch of Kentucky farmland, is a form of territorial coexistence that includes an active, ongoing assessment of the specific humans sharing that ground, sustained over multiple human generations, distinguishing at some level between routine agricultural activity that poses no threat and situations, like an approaching severe storm capable of killing a specific family, that call for a departure from the otherwise consistent pattern of quiet avoidance. Whether that distinction reflects genuine cognitive sophistication approaching something we would recognize in ourselves, or whether it reflects a form of animal intelligence operating on principles we do not yet have a framework for, is not a question this account can answer definitively. What it can say, based on everything gathered here, is that the evidence resists every simpler explanation that would ordinarily be reached for first. It was not an oversized wolf, and it was not a misidentified bear, and it was not a farmer's exhausted imagination running wild under stress, given that the same essential details appear independently in an elderly neighbor's decades-old family story that Merle had never heard before. His own encounter prompted him to ask, something large, physically capable, and behaviorally restrained has been sharing this specific stretch of the Pennyroyal Plateau with farming families for at least half a century, and on at least one documented occasion, it chose to extend that restraint into something that looked, by any reasonable measure, like an act of deliberate care. There is a broader point worth sitting with here, one that goes beyond Merle's own farm and his own family. Every Dogman account gathered across decades of research, from the Great Lakes forests Godfrey documented to the depot ground and timberland cases that have surfaced further west, shares this same underlying tension, an animal capable of overwhelming violence, built with the size and strength to end a human life in seconds, that consistently, across independent witnesses who have never compared notes, chooses not to. That restraint is not weakness. It is not an accident of temperament. It reads, across every well-documented case, as a policy, consistently applied, by a population that has apparently decided, for reasons that remain entirely its own, that the humans sharing its territory are not worth the risk and the exposure that violence against them would invite. Merle's case adds something the others do not. It adds a single, verified instance where that consistent policy of restraint tipped over, briefly and at enormous personal cost to the animal involved, into something that looked less like tolerance and more like an active choice to protect. What this has done to Merle personally, 2 years on, is not the kind of change that shows up in a single dramatic gesture. It shows up in the accumulation of small adjustments he has made to a life that, before that September, ran on the same predictable rhythm it had run on for over 3 decades. He still rises before 4 most mornings. He still works the same ground his grandfather cleared. But there is a version of Merle now. One Faye describes carefully and with obvious affection, who pauses at the kitchen window, some yangs, and looks out toward the tree line along the creek for a moment longer than the view requires, who has become, in her words, a little more careful with the people he loves, a little quicker to say the things he might once have assumed did not need saying, in a way she attributes directly to a man who came close, on one ordinary September night, to losing everything that mattered to him, and knows it. He said a debt like that does not get repaid by pretending it never happened. That friend, a man who served 2 tours overseas before coming home to work construction and hunt the same Kentucky ground he grew up on, brought his own frame of reference to Merle's story that Merle found unexpectedly steadying. He told Merle, during one of their walks, that in his own experience overseas, the animals that survive longest in contested, dangerous territory are rarely the most aggressive ones. They are the ones that understand exactly when force is necessary and when restraint serves them better, an ability to read a situation and choose the response that costs the least and preserves the most. He said what Merle described sounded to him less like an animal acting on blind instinct and more like something operating on the same calculus he had seen in the most capable people he served alongside, people who understood that survival over the long run depends on knowing which battles are worth having and which ones are not. Whether that comparison holds up under any formal scientific scrutiny is beside the point to Merle. What matters to him is that a man whose judgment he trusts completely, on matters of danger and restraint, that Merle himself has no comparable experience to draw on, looked at this account and did not see something monstrous. He saw something calculating, patient, and, in the one instance that mattered most, generous. His hunting buddy, the one with the army background, has become the closest thing Merle has to a regular confidant on the subject, and the 2 men have developed something like an informal practice of walking sections of the property together on weekends. Not hunting, not working, just walking, the way men who have known each other their whole lives will sometimes do, when neither one particularly wants to talk about what is actually on his mind, but both understand that the walking itself is the point. Merle told us that during one of these walks, close to a year after the storm, his friend asked him directly whether he regretted any of it. The roof, the insurance fight, the strange new caution that had crept into how Merle moves through his own land after dark. Merle said no, without hesitation, and then added words that have stayed with his friend since. He said that whatever is out there gave his family back to him on a night when it had every reason in the world to simply let nature take its course and save whatever remained of its own dwindling strength for itself. He said a debt like that does not get repaid by pretending it never happened. The tobacco crop came in fine that first spring after the storm, and it has come in fine every spring since. Cut and hung in the same curing barns his father built, cured over the same hickory smoke that has flavored dark-fired Kentucky tobacco for longer than anyone in Todd County can trace with certainty. The cattle still graze the upper pastures. The hay still gets cut on schedule for the neighbors who depend on Merle's custom work to get their own winters covered. From the county road, nothing about that farm looks any different than it did the day before the storm came through. And that, Merle says, is exactly how he wants it to stay. Whatever changed happened somewhere underneath the surface of an ordinary working farm, in the relationship between one family and whatever has apparently shared their ground, quietly and without acknowledgement, for 3 generations before anyone in that family had reason to notice. Dark-fired tobacco itself is worth understanding for what it represents in this specific part of Kentucky, because the process is unusual enough nationally that it says something about how tied this family's livelihood is to the exact ground where all of this happened. Unlike the air-cured burley grown further east and north across the bluegrass region, dark-fired tobacco is cured by hanging the harvested leaf in enclosed barns and smoldering hardwood fires beneath it for days at a time, a technique specific to a narrow band of counties across western Kentucky and adjoining Tennessee, producing the dense, smoky leaf used primarily in snuff and chewing tobacco products. Merle's father learned the technique from his own father, who learned it from a generation before that, and the specific fire-tending knowledge, knowing exactly how hot to keep the smolder and how long to let the smoke work into the hanging leaf, is the kind of skill passed down inside families rather than taught in any formal program. It is one more thread tying Merle's family to this exact patch of ground across multiple generations, the same generations during which, based on everything Merle has since uncovered, something else has been quietly sharing that ground alongside them the entire time. Merle does not expect anyone watching this to believe every detail of what he experienced, and he told us as much, plainly, without defensiveness, the last time we spoke. He said he has stopped needing anyone else to believe it, because the roof is gone and rebuilt. The National Weather Service survey is a matter of public record anyone can request, and the 4 minutes of difference between when he got his family in the truck and when that warning came out over the radio for Todd County is not something he needed to convince himself of after the fact. He knows what happened in that field. He knows what he owes to something that never asked him for anything, and that he still, 2 years later, cannot fully explain to his own satisfaction. He still walks down to the sycamore near the creek sometimes, in full daylight, alone, and stands at the spot where the blood pool once soaked into the ground before 2 years of Kentucky rain washed every trace of it away. He does not know exactly why he goes. He has told us it is not out of fear, and it is not out of curiosity in the way a man might return to the site of an accident looking for answers the ground cannot give him. He thinks, most of the time when he lets himself sit with the question honestly, that he is simply saying thank you. In whatever quiet, private way a man raised not to talk much about his feelings, knows how to say it to something that asked for nothing in return, and got, from Merle at least, a debt he intends to keep for as long as that farm belongs to his family. One last piece of the record deserves mention, because it is the closest thing to a second, independent visual confirmation this account has, even though it never rose to the level of formal evidence. About 4 months after the storm, in the following January, Merle's son was driving the county road that runs along the eastern boundary of the farm, returning from a construction job in Hopkinsville well after dark, when his headlights swept across a fence row and caught, for no more than a second or two, a tall shape standing motionless at the edge of a cedar thicket before it turned and was gone. He did not stop the truck. He told Merle about it the next morning, hesitantly, expecting to be told he had seen a deer standing awkwardly or a neighbor's escaped horse, and instead found his father listening with complete seriousness and asking careful, specific questions about height, posture, and the shape of the head. His son's description, given independently and without any coaching, matched what Merle had seen in the field months earlier, closely enough that Merle no longer had any doubt his own encounter had not been a singular, isolated event, confined to one bad night in September. Whatever moves through that stretch of the sinking fork corridor was still there, still using the same general travel routes along the property boundary, months after the storm that first brought it to the family's attention. That sighting is also, as far as Merle knows, the last time anyone in his immediate family has seen the animal itself directly, as opposed to the second-hand track sign, the fence damage a mile north, and his granddaughter's occasional, untroubled mentions of a big dog at the tree line. 4 months of an otherwise ordinary Kentucky winter, and then nothing further that anyone could point to directly, though Merle assumes that says more about how rarely this population allows itself to be seen than it does about whether it is still there. Merle told us, near the end of our last conversation, why he had finally decided to talk about any of this at all after 2 years of keeping it inside a very small circle of family and close friends. It was not, he said, any sudden desire for attention or vindication. It was something his granddaughter said to him during one of her recent visits, on an afternoon when she was helping him check a fence line along the edge of the lower field in broad daylight, safely, the way children help their grandfathers on farms everywhere. She had asked him, out of nowhere, whether the big dog she sometimes saw at the tree line was the reason they did not use that field anymore. Merle had not realized she had put that connection together on her own, quietly, the way children sometimes do, without ever saying anything about it, until the question simply arrives. He told her, carefully, that the field was resting, which was true in the ordinary agricultural sense, and also true in the sense he could not yet explain to a 9-year-old. She accepted the answer and went back to helping with the fence, and Merle stood there afterward, turning over the fact that his granddaughter, without ever being told anything, had arrived independently at something close to the truth. That was when he decided that the story deserved to exist somewhere outside his own family and his own small circle of confidants. It is not that he needs anyone to believe him. It is that he has come to think that a family this fortunate owes something to the possibility that another family, somewhere else, in another county or another state, might be standing in a field of their own someday, looking at something dying in the grass and trying to decide, in the space of a few critical seconds, whether to trust what their gut is telling them or to write it off as their imagination and go back to bed. Merle wants that family, whoever and wherever they eventually turn out to be, to at least have heard a story like his own before that moment arrives for them, so that when their own instinct tells them to move, they move. The storm passed through Todd County years ago now, one severe weather event among the dozens that move across the Pennyroyal Plateau every year, unremarkable in the National Weather Service's records, except for the swath of wind damage it left along a corridor that happened to pass directly over one farmhouse that was empty when it should not have been. The roof is new. The barn stands rebuilt. The lower field still floods first and drains last on the whole farm, exactly as it always has, and Merle still will not graze it after dark. If you ever find yourself driving Highway 80 between Elkton and Hopkinsville on a clear night, past the fence lines and the tobacco barns and the dark stretch of bottomland where the sinking fork cuts through Todd County, you are passing within a few hundred yards of everything in this story. The field is still there. The sycamore is still there, and whatever came out of that timber to carry one of its own back into the dark still moves through that same ground on its own schedule, on the same quiet terms it has apparently kept with the farming families along that creek for as long as anyone's family history reaches back. Merle does not need you to believe every piece of this. He has said as much himself, plainly, more than once. What he asks, if you take anything from this at all, is that you consider the possibility that the ground under a lot of ordinary, unremarkable farms across this country is shared in ways nobody talks about, held together by decades of quiet, unspoken arrangements between families and whatever moves through their fields after the sun goes down, arrangements that only ever come to light when something happens extraordinary enough to break the silence that everyone involved had every reason to keep. Merle checks the weather every morning the same way he always has, coffee in hand at that same kitchen table, and some mornings, when the forecast calls for storms building out of the southwest, he finds himself glancing toward the lower field before he can stop himself, the way a man checks on something he cares about without quite admitting to himself that is what he is doing. He has never seen anything down there since. He does not expect to, but he still looks, every time, because some debts are not the kind a man forgets he owes, and because some part of him still hopes that whatever is out there knows he is looking, somewhere down along the sinking fork, in timber and limestone hollows that have sheltered whatever moves through that drainage for longer than any survey or deed has ever accounted for. Something is still out there, still keeping whatever distance it has always kept from the people who work that ground, except on the one occasion when the distance stopped mattering more than a family's survival did. That is the whole of what Merle knows for certain, and it is enough for him to keep farming that ground exactly the way he always has, one careful season at a time.